This is Street Knowledge with Chris Graham.
Welcome to the podcast, Chris Graham and Rod Mullins, and this is going to be fun. We had a great race this past weekend, the Charlotte Motor Speedway, and Rod was there in person, and I got to know what it was like. Those last few laps, of course, I guess it was 5 laps to go. There was a stop, a long break, and then we had a race to the finish. Jimmie Johnson, Martin Truex Jr., they get to the last turn, and the world turned upside down. Rod, what was it like there, and take us through what happened?
It was shocking, to say the least. That last 5 laps, the 14-minute delay that we had in the red flag situation, but it was unreal. It's absolutely probably one of the best races that I have watched in quite a while. And this development of the ROVAL has been exactly what Charlotte needed and exactly what NASCAR needed, I think, to kind of boost a little bit of the morale and everything else going on with NASCAR. And the way that the ratings have been, the way that the ticket prices, the attendance, all these different things, all of that kind of righted the ship, so to speak. And everybody was talking about it. People were thrilled. But that last few laps, and Jimmie Johnson trying to make that pass on Martin Truex to go for the win, a lot of people have questioned why he did it in the first place. I know exactly why he did it in the first place. He wanted the win, just like Martin Truex wanted that win. They both wanted the win, and at that point, that's where you go and you throw everything to the wind and say, hey, if I've got a chance to try to win this race, I'm going to give it a shot. And that's what Jimmie Johnson did. And it ultimately, though, in the end, cost him a chance at the playoffs. His first time ever at missing the playoffs. And he's been doing some soul searching since that happened. He's been kind of in that situation we all have said it once before, should I or shouldn't I? And he chose to go with should I, and I'll pass. And that's what ended up happening. He got loose. He went into Truex. Truex was not very happy at the end of the race on the cool-down lap. He goes, he bumps and sends Jimmie Johnson around as they're coming into the pit road part of the ROVAL. But I'm telling you, Chris, it was one whale of a race. And if anybody did not go down there and see it in person, I'm telling you, you missed a phenomenal event.
Now, let me ask this question. On the TV broadcast, they had all that time with that 14-minute delay, the red flag, as you mentioned. So there was a lot of time to fill. And they were going through, the announcers were going through the various scenarios related to the 16 who would advance to 12, or be narrowed down to 12. And where guys were at that time, Johnson seemed like he was in pretty good shape. And then as the last 5 laps developed, and it was clear that it was going to be Truex and Johnson 1-2, the announcers were saying, the NBC guys were saying, especially that last lap, hey, Johnson looked pretty good, with the unofficial scores based on where they were placed at the time. Johnson was rather safe. He was like 8 or 9 points ahead of that cut line. And so Dale Earnhardt Jr. actually was the guy who said, hey, he ought to go for it here. Is there any indication, is there anything from the post-race that gives us an indication that Johnson and his crew chief were discussing that at all? Like, hey, you're pretty good. If you go for the win here and you still finish second, you're still gonna have a chance here. And of course, they're not anticipating he's going to spin out and knock him and Truex both out, at least of the running for 1-2. But was there any of that discussion afterwards that Johnson maybe was saying, hey, I actually felt like I was in good shape and I could go for the win, whether or not something like that happened?
Yeah, Johnson had a car that I think that a lot of people were surprised with. But Jimmie Johnson has had this kind of training. He was brought up on this kind of track. And for him, he had not had as much bad luck as some of the other drivers, or at least inconsistencies when it came to running a road course like this before. But for him, I think he and Jackie Now's both, I think they figured, we've got the car to beat, hopefully out of this one. We're just going to give it a shot and see what happens. And that's exactly what they did. They went for it. But you have to understand, too, that Jimmie Johnson was in a situation when he kind of went over the turtles and the chicane, as they called it right there. That's what actually got him loose. And he went into Truex at that point, and he lost control of the car at that point. And when that happened, Truex just went in front of him. Truex then went up the racetrack, and Jimmie Johnson, he limped across the finish line, but was already too far behind at that point, and that's that combined with that tiebreaker that they had in there at the cutoff. That's what ultimately cost Johnson the chance at getting into the playoffs because, he had a win. He's been 51 races without a win, and this could have been a big win for him if he'd been able to pull this off, and if he'd even finished maybe top 1, top 2 right in there in that finishing spot. He could have probably got into the playoffs, but it just wasn't meant to be that day.
One other thing, before that 14-minute delay, did we ever figure out what happened? There was, I think it's turn 1, where it seemed like, I can't think who the first driver was who went into the wall there, but then it seemed like there were a number of guys, 8 or 10 guys maybe, who followed right into the wall there, and it was almost like, I don't know, like sheep going to slaughter. I mean, they couldn't help themselves from going into the wall. What happened there?
Well, that's been a lot of talk about that. Brad Keselowski says, I overshot my marks. I don't know if there's just something that came up in his mind. I thought about this. I thought about this actually on the drive back to Wise on Sunday night, was the fact of, here he was, maybe, just maybe, he went brain dead for just a split millisecond, and he thought, I've got to commit here and going into the turn here and not make Heartburn Turn is sponsored by Tums. That was the thing. I think he'd done that most all day, but then everything was on the line. Maybe he was trying to protect his groove. I don't know what the situation was, but it's almost like he zoned out momentarily when all that happened, and that's where it stood. And then everybody else kind of following as they're there in the shade. That was a little shady part of the track. Maybe everybody saw it. It's moving so fast. We'll just follow Keselowski's lead and see what happens, and then immediately that's when the chain reaction to everything started at that point. And then you have the Nard, you had your second place driver and Kyle Larson go into it as well. Kyle Busch got some damage out of it, but that was because of incidental damage, everybody going together there at that one point. I'll tell you, the thing that we noticed that day, especially Saturday and then more on Sunday, was everybody else, they were telling us where to shoot at around the track in different places. Pedestrian crosswalk. We imagined at one point that it was going to be that 16 and 17 turn as they get right there on the front stretch, and they came through that little part. I mean, Bubba Wallace and Eric Jones both tore up 2 great cars on that day because they had the barrier moved up a little bit. NASCAR moved it back. And then when they got there into turn 1, I started talking with someone else and then started talking to my son. I said, I really wish we'd been up there at Heartburn Turn because that's where a lot of the action was taking place, especially in the latter stages of the race. I think Keselowski and company kind of overstated or overshot their mark, so to speak, and I think that's what cost them ultimately in the race for that win.
So Ryan Blaney emerges. He gets the win. No one was thinking on that last lap that Ryan Blaney was going to get the win. Johnson and Truex running ahead, they were so far ahead of the rest of the pack on that last lap. So what does this win mean for Ryan Blaney?
Well, it puts him in the playoffs. He's in the playoffs. He's in the midst of things. I think the last time that I saw him in the playoff standings, he's something like 3rd right now. So he's gotten a big win, a big boost going into that playoff picture right now. But for him, more importantly, this is Penske. I mean, Penske, they've already had a lot of success with Brad Keselowski winning 3 straight leading up to this point. Ryan Blaney now has picked up a little bit of the slack as to what happened with Keselowski, and he was just there at the right place at the right time. And Ryan Blaney said in the media center after the race was over with, he said, I hate it for all these guys. I hate it for the guys that were the front runners because they had a great car for the day. But, we kind of just laid there. We kind of were just waiting for something to happen. And it just happened to be our luck. The opening came. We just drove on through, and we drove on to a win. But for him, it was a big morale boost, and especially going into the rest of this part of the playoffs. He could be a contender in there. And if Keselowski gets back into this, the Penske forces, they can be tough to deal with going down this stretch.
So I have to ask, outside of what happened on the track and everything else, what was the weekend like? What was the atmosphere like there? It seemed like, like you said, it was one of the best races I've seen, and certainly in a long time. from a NASCAR perspective. It looked like the TV ratings were great for it, but what was it like there in Charlotte, in Concord, I guess, actually, but what was it like there at the Speedway just to be a part of that?
It was just unreal. Of course, this was my first time really at Charlotte, and then, of course, in the infield. I'd been there as a fan about 20-some years ago, but for this being my first time in the pits and everything, the hospitality was just wonderful from the folks at Charlotte Motor Speedway. Another thing about it was this was simply a learning experience for a lot of people there. There was the media having to learn. A lot of this media that covers NASCAR racing, they've covered road courses before, but for them, this ROVAL was a little bit of a different thing. Photographers actually were being told by security, you can't shoot here, even though they may have been cleared. You know, it was all new, trying to keep people away from the action, so to speak, because it was right close on you. Roger Penske also talked about it, and he said in the media center after Ryan Blaney's win, he said the ROVAL was almost the closest thing as what you would have with a street race, like with one of the Indy cars or the Formula One cars when they race through the streets in a town somewhere like, say, Petersburg, Florida, or, you know, just to name a few. Does that mean it's going to happen for NASCAR to start making a street race before it's over with? Not hardly, because as Roger Penske said, it's going to be 42 to 43 cars, and it's going to be just mass pandemonium compared to some of those Indy cars when they only run about 23 cars on the track, and they're a lot heavier, so there's a lot of differences there. But when we talk about the atmosphere, it was just nothing but, to me, almost a huge party atmosphere. And one of the big things that came out of it this past weekend was the interaction between the fans and also the management at Charlotte Motor Speedway. You know, one big thing they were making, they were saying, I heard this said in the media center and everything else, this was being told, hey, you've got football to watch, but you know what? This is going to be more exciting than the football game that's going to be on television this afternoon. That was one of the first things that I'd heard, because NASCAR's kind of stayed away from the football competition, so to speak. Well, the ratings definitely showed that there was some improvement having a race like this in the playoff picture, and especially the ROVAL race at Charlotte. So that was a positive for it. But one of the big things that I got out of this was I had a chance to actually talk to the executive vice president of Charlotte Motor Speedway, and he asked me for my thoughts as to what I thought, how the race went. This was one of those weird things that just came out of going to this race. I'd had a chance to see him and talk to him a little bit back at Bristol in August, but then when I saw him at the racetrack this time around, he remembered me, came up, he said, what can we improve on? What can we do? And he said, what do you think of the race? And I thought, the race was great. You couldn't ask for a better race. I said, I know you've got some kinks that are going to have to be worked out, as with everything for a first time. But I told Greg Walter, I said, you guys have done a great job with this. You've done a great job promoting it, and I think it's going to be a staple. But a lot of fans were talking, is this going to be a part of the 600 for next year in May? And I said, no. And Greg Walter told me the same thing. He said the format of the 1.5-mile oval there at Charlotte Motor Speedway, the Coke 600, it will remain intact. But they have this on the circuit for at least the next 2 to 3 years. So it's going to make some big impact for NASCAR, especially at Charlotte, for the next 2 or 3 years.
Put it on permanently. Let's tell them that. Put this race on permanently on the schedule every fall. Let's make it just go ahead and put it there and write it in pen. Don't even write it in pencil. You can't erase this. Let's do this. Let's do this one down the road. So let's let's switch gears now and go off the track for a couple of stories. Rules package, 2019 rules package has been announced by NASCAR. Take us into that story.
Well, the 2019 rules pack is essentially the package is essentially what they ran the All-Star race back in May down at Charlotte, and they had a lot of success out of it. There's some changes to the air dam. You can go online and you can probably see that more in more detail. There's going to be accommodations made for the hole that's down there in the front of the air dam for the brakes, what you're going to be able to cover up. Just different things about the way that just the little things. There's going to be a little bit more of a edge sticking out of, so to speak, of the bumper, or at least the way that the molding, the way that the bumper is on the front air dam of the car. But it's a really good aero package. It's a great aero package that allowed these cars to kind of, I wouldn't say bunch up at the All-Star race, but it kind of evened a lot of the cars out on that 1.5-mile track. Now, as for everything else, you're going to see some changes in some horsepower. Now, this is all going to be kind of included together in this rules package. The horsepower is actually going to be lower. When you go to a small track or a short track like Bristol, they're actually going to lower the speeds just a little bit, or the horsepower, so to speak. It's not going to take away from the speeds because the crew chiefs and the teams are going to find a way to be able to crank more miles per hour out of those cars, but they're lowering the horsepower out of it to where they can kind of get, to me, I guess, a little bit more of a bunched up kind of racing, but it's, again, that all-star aero package where everybody's going to kind of be evenly matched, so to speak, when they hit the track. Anything under 1.5 miles, they're not going to fool with any kind of restrictor plate or anything else. But when they go to Daytona and Talladega, they will have spacers. It's not going to be the old restrictor plate that went right on top of the carburetor, so to speak, and then reduce the airflow. The smaller the hole, the less, wind, the less air, and the less gas that you've got coming through there. They're actually going to be pieces of metal that's going to be put into these carburetors, and they're going to have just space in between them. That they're not going to have any hole that will limit the amount of horsepower they'll be able to crank out on those cars when they get on the high beams. And we'll probably be looking maybe at some 200-mile-an-hour speeds, maybe close to that. They've already had that here over the last several years. But what I think is going to happen, it's going to evenly match a lot of cars out on the tracks where you're not going to have breakaway racing, so to speak. It's kind of like what we had here several years ago. And some of the fans didn't like it because it seemed like when they pulled out of the draft, they got there and then everybody pulled up together with them all one at a time. But I think this will force the teams to kind of come up with a different kind of tweaking package, so to speak, when it comes with their engines.
Yeah, it makes it more exciting when it's closer. You get to see the skill of the drivers more, so that's a good thing about all that. Final thing. Let's go to Dover. Let's look at preview Dover and the next race in the playoffs.
Dover's going to be an interesting race. I'll just say this. I don't know if you're actually going to see any kind of tempers flare, especially from this last race at Charlotte. But Dover is one of those important icons on the circuit where it's an all-concrete track. It's got the banking. It's a little bit more of a stretched out and longer Bristol. But, that race is going to definitely show who's going to be able to rebound back from this Charlotte race and see where they can go from there. Will we see a win by Jimmy Johnson? Could be. Jimmy Johnson's been good at Dover in the past few years. But, Kyle Busch is looking he's trying to pad something. He's trying to pad at least a little bit on his lead. That's what he was hoping for at Charlotte. He didn't get a chance to do that this time around. But Dover would be that opportunity for him. And it also sets up these cars kind of taking a step a little bit further and a little bit closer as we start getting close to Talladega. We're going to be seeing probably some more jockeying for some positions of how they're going to actually start getting their cars ready by the time we get to Talladega here in a few weeks. And then we've got Martinsville. They'll be coming back into Martinsville, so reducing all that package back down to a short track package again. Once again, it's going to be pandemonium, so to speak. I think we've seen pandemonium from this Charlotte race, and I think we're going to see it all the way through to Homestead because the jockeying and the way that these standings are going to go, it's anybody's guess right now.
Yeah, I love the scheduling, the challenge from week to week. It's not cookie cutter. They're going from a very nice varied set of tracks to test these drivers out. So it's a great schedule this year for especially with the ROVAL being added to it. Well, Rod, I'm jealous. You got to have this great weekend in Charlotte. You had a great time, I'm sure, and for our listeners out there, if you happen to miss Rod's coverage of both the Xfinity race and the Monster Energy race, you can go back to our archives. We have a NASCAR section on the site, all of Rod's stories highlighted there, so you can go there on our AugustaFreePress.com website. Well, Rod, thanks for your time.
Appreciate it, Chris. Thank you.